part of what makes Iceland so epic is the driving is just what you get to see. And this was one of those roads that we were happy we went down. So we're here this morning at this amazing location in southern Iceland, and this is going to be a quick lesson on stitching. So this is a really big mountain behind me, and in order to get it all in frame, I either have to use a really wide 14mm lens, or I have to do something a little bit different. Now, right now, using the 14mm lens, you can see that it does fit everything in frame, but it's really pushing the boundaries on the left and right. I mean, I'm barely able to frame this mountain in. Let's say I had something like a 24-70 or a regular kit lens, 24-105. This is a pretty common lens that we all have and use. Now, if I only had 24mm, you can see by this reference shot that I cannot get the mountain in frame. It's pretty much impossible with a single shot. In this lesson, I want to focus on a simple way to get a panoramic image if you don't have a wide enough lens to capture the scene. Now, as you can see, my camera is set to portrait mode instead of landscape. That's because at 24mm, I want to get as much of the top and the bottom, the sky and the reflection as possible. I have unlimited capability to stitch from left to right. So if it's in vertical mode, as I move the camera and capture these shots, I'm going to get as much of the sky and as much of the foreground as possible. If I had it rotated to landscape mode, I wouldn't get as much of the sky and the foreground. Another nice thing about shooting panos in portrait mode is it gives us the ability to crop later. Since we have all that extra room at the top and the bottom, we can crop our image down and make it exactly how we want in post. The worst case scenario would be to shoot this in landscape mode and end up with this really long, skinny panorama image that's really hard to display on a monitor. Most cameras today have an auto panorama stitching feature, but what happens is the camera clicks through, takes all these shots, merges them all together and only saves them at the max megapixel rating for the camera. So if you have a, let's say a 12 or 16 megapixel camera and you shoot 30 automatic images in your camera and then the camera puts them all together and then you still only end up with a 12 or 16 megapixel JPEG image at the end. By doing this manually, shot for shot, we end up with complete control over each individual RAW file and we get to stitch a pano that has a very, very high megapixel count. So as you can see, I have my camera set up here. The first thing that I've done is I've been very, very careful to level the tripod the best to my ability. Now, so far in this tutorial, I've been shooting with a bigger tripod. That's a TVC-33 by Really Right Stuff. It's rated for much more weight. This is a smaller, more compact, lightweight version tripod, but I wanted to show you guys that you can pretty much do this with any tripod. It can be a really, really cheap tripod, a really expensive one that's rated for a lot of weight or very little weight. And the reason is we've been using the timer function in the camera. So what I have this set for each frame that I take, I'm gonna press the trigger on the camera and it's gonna wait 2 seconds before it takes the photo. This gives me the ability to mitigate any vibration that I would cause by touching the camera between shots. A little bit about this ball head that I'm using. This is a BH40 by Really Right Stuff. The nice thing about this ball head is it has an independent function for rotation. So after I set it and lock in and make sure that it's level, I can adjust the bottom knob here and I can actually spin it 360 degrees independent of its own level function. So this just spins on the axis and it doesn't upset the level. Having the ability to rotate the ball head independently is a really, really strong feature. If your tripod head doesn't support this, you're gonna have to try to readjust the frame for each shot. And you wanna be really careful that you keep your horizon line dead center each time you do that. So the tripod is nice and level. What I'm gonna do now in the camera is I'm gonna level my horizon. And I'm gonna use my in-camera level feature to make sure that that is perfectly aligned and level. I wanna make sure that as I spin this around and capture my series of shots, that that horizon line stays perfectly centered the entire time. One other thing I'm gonna do since I'm gonna be stitching these images together is I'm not gonna use auto white balance. I'm gonna make sure to set my own custom Kelvin temperature so that it's consistent throughout each frame. In addition to locking down the white balance at a custom Kelvin temperature, I've also set the camera to manual mode and I've picked custom settings so that each time I click a frame, it's going to be consistent. So when I go to stitch this together, there won't be any variation in color and light. Now when I'm shooting, it's important to have a little overlap on each frame. That's because when I'm stitching, the software is going to have to find those areas that match so that it can put it all together. A good rule of thumb, without calculating how much overlap you need, you can use 1/3 overlap. That seems to do a great job no matter what you're stitching. So let's go ahead and take these shots and let's see how it looks. So with this shot, it looks like I needed 5 images to create the entire panorama. Now keep in mind that this is a really easy way to shoot panos if you just have a tripod and a regular ball head. All right, so let's take these files into Photoshop now and I'll show you how to stitch them together. So here we are, lesson 4. You guys remember Westerhorn Mountain, where I showed you guys how to shoot and prepare to stitch a panoramic image. But let's take a look at some images before we get started. This image that you're seeing right here was shot at 14 millimeters. So you can see I get the mountain completely in frame. But we talked about in the video portion of this, what would happen if I only had a 24 millimeter lens? Well, here's the result. So that's definitely different. I cannot get the mountain entirely in frame. But what happens if I turn the camera on its side? Well, if I turn the camera on its side, I still can't get it in frame, but I am getting more of the sky and more of the water. So in the video, remember that I made everything level, and I basically shot from either left to right or right to left to capture the entire sequence to put together in a pano. So if we take a look at this from left to right, you can see that I've had an overlap about 1/3, just like I explained in the video portion, and I've been able to capture the entire mountain. So what we're going to do, we're going to build pano files in a couple different ways. I've actually prepared a couple different sets of files for you guys here so we can do it a couple different ways. And now, actually new to Lightroom in this version when we're doing this processing is the ability to stitch panos right inside of Lightroom. Again, this is a new feature in Lightroom. Chances are in the next version they'll add more features, but right now let's take a look at the features that they have built right into Lightroom. So this is a really fast, quick way to get a good preview of what your pano is going to look like. Before we do that though, we might have to do some basic raw adjustment. You can see the sky above here is a little bit blown out and the water looks really nice. So all I'm going to do here is pull the highlights down a little bit, just so that I can get some of that sky detail back in. So it doesn't mirror the water. Water is usually going to be a little darker than your sky, but it's still going to start to bring those details back. Just when I do that, I feel like this image is a little bit cold. So instead of warming it up in Photoshop, since I'm going to stitch this together, I did lock my white balance when I was shooting, but I think I'm going to change the temperature a little bit and just start to warm it up, just so it's not so gray and cool. Start to get some of the color back in the mountain here. Since I have some settings here, I have -71 for highlights and 15,194 for the temperature. I'm going to right click on this file, I'm going to go to Develop Settings, and I'm going to go to Copy Settings. And lens corrections I'm going to turn off. Sharpening's already been set in this one, but I'm going to change it to white balance and basic tone. So when I copy this, it's going to copy all those attributes from this file, then I'm going to select the other ones, right click again, go back up to Develop Settings, paste those settings. Now they're going to be nice and sync. So the next step is to select them all, and I can go up to the photo option or I can right click, and I'm going to go to Photo Merge, Panorama. And you can see that it stitched my panorama, and on the right here is sort of a lack of options. I have 3 options for the way that it's going to map this pano. Let's just check them out real quick. There's spherical, it's going to build a preview for this, cylindrical, and you can see both spherical and cylindrical are kind of stretching the mountain up. It looks sort of bloated. It doesn't look like a long mountain chain. It kind of looks a little bit tall, a little bit squashed. It's really not the best version of this pano, so let's change it. Let's see what perspective does. Well, and automatically perspective does pretty good, does a nicer job. Stretches this back out, albeit a little bit wild in the corners, which is okay. We also shot this at 24 millimeter. So doing a perspective one, expect it to get a little bit stretched out. One thing that I have enabled here is auto crop. If I take this off, you can actually see what it's done to the stitch. You see that it's actually stretched this out to maintain the perspective in the center. I like to auto crop it because I don't really need all of that extra detail. And then once you click merge, it'll go ahead and build the panorama. What's really cool about the panorama functions inside of Lightroom, even though they have a lack of options, it'll take all of these raw files. Now remember I was shooting with the Nikon D810, 36 megapixel. It took all 6 of these files, put them together, and when I click merge, it's actually going to make it another raw file. So it's going to make an Adobe DNG, which is basically Adobe's own generic raw file. So I have started with 6 raw files, and it's going to bake it into a raw file and still give me the adjustment properties that I have associated with raw. So that is very powerful. Let's say merge. Being that these are 36 megapixels times 6, this takes a little bit of time to bake in this panorama file. So the faster your computer, the faster this is going to happen. My computer is pretty fast, and it's still going to take just a little bit of extra time. But be patient, brew some coffee, and you should be fine. After a little bit of time, the pano is completed, and you can see it actually brought it right into our Lightroom catalog here to the right, so we can take a look at that. It will take a little while to load, and you can see this ridiculous file size right here of nearly 20,000 pixels. So that is a massive pano file. So what I might want to do is just crop it down a little bit, and you can see it's maintained all those edges, and we can just sort of compare it to what we had. So I have this big pano file, the mountain here. Go ahead and close down the crop, and here's the original that I shot at 14 millimeter, and then here's the pano file. So obviously not too much visual difference, and again, sorry for the load time here for the 120 megapixel pano, but there's not going to be that much visual difference, but my resolution is going to be extraordinary. So if you wanted to print this wall size, if you wanted to print a billboard, clients could ask you for massive files to put on billboards, and they could ask for a 200 megapixel file. So if you have time in a location and you really want to punish your computer's CPUs and hard drive, you can shoot 36 megapixel or 50 megapixel pano files. So here what I've done this right in Lightroom, and you can see it's a pretty good result, though we don't have many options. Well, what do you think? Could there be other ways to do this? Yes, there are. So what I've done before Lightroom had this built-in feature we could just create panos, I always exported stuff into Photoshop. Now, being that I can export it into Photoshop also gives me the possibility to shrink these down a little bit. So if I wanted to create a full-size pano, I could just select these and see I've prepared another pano file for us to look at here, which has some nice foreground elements. So instead of doing this at 36 megapixel, I actually exported these as TIFF files, or in this case, JPEG files, to keep the file size down even more at 3,000 pixels each instead of 7,000, just so that we can speed through this and I can give you the example. So while this one was done in Lightroom, let's go ahead and go into Photoshop and I'll show you how to do the same exact thing in Photoshop. So the first thing you want to do is take your files, export them either full resolution or low resolution. Another good rule of thumb is to export them first at low resolution, build a preview, see if you even like the panorama first, or do the preview in Lightroom, and then see if it's worth investing the time for the huge pano. Because it's not just time creating it, it's then time editing it, saving it, and everything else. So I've already prepared these files, so I'm going to go into Photoshop real quick. And the way to do panos in Photoshop is to go to File, Automate, Photo Merge. And it's going to ask me which files I want to bring in. On the left, it's going to ask me how I want to do the mapping here. But I'm going to say Browse. And I've already selected these. They're inside of the folder. They're inside of the project folder. You'll see a Pano Files folder. So you can go ahead and try the ones that I've already exported. Hit Open. And blend them together. That should automatically be checked. And we'll just say OK. And we'll run through this process. Let's take a look at the result inside of Photoshop. And it actually did a pretty good job. The mountain's a little bit compressed. That's okay. Again, Photoshop, it's a little bit better than Lightroom in that you have more options, but there's still very limited preview options. There's some advanced pano software that I use as well, a couple different pieces of software, but this is an easy way to get started. In tutorial number 2 that we're going to be releasing, I'm actually going to be using some of those pieces of software to show you the more robust tool set that you have and the more advanced preview options and distortion removal and different things like that. But 9 times out of 10, if you just want to shoot a quick pano without a gimbal or without anything complex, just a ball head tripod or any kind of independently rotating rig, this is going to work and you're going to be 100% fine. So inside of Photoshop, let's take a look. You can see that each one's come in on a layer, and some of them have really funny masks. You can see that this one here is just this little piece, and then for some reason it's only taking these tiny little pieces from this. I'm never sure why or exactly how the reasoning is behind this and the way it masks. The nice thing is in Photoshop is it usually is pretty seamless. So the next step, the next thing that I'd want to do is crop this, and again I'm just going to clear the cropping. I'm just going to crop it down. I just kind of want to see what we have here. get rid of the boundaries, the edge, crop this down, and crop this down. Inside of the crop, there's one option that I want to show you guys, that's delete cropped pixels. If I leave this off and hit enter, all of that data is still going to be there. I could crop again, stretch this out, and it would come back just in case I want to change my mind. If I don't want to change my mind, I can say delete cropped pixels, hit enter, and then it's going to delete those edges that are outside of the crop. And the benefit of this is that it'll also delete them and keep the file size down, which is very important. In this case, I don't need all these layers. If I select them all, I can do a Command E for merge all, and then I'm going to get my pano file. So that's basically the intro to creating panoramic files when you're in the field. And remember, these were shot at 24mm vertical mode, so you want that in portrait mode so you can capture more of the sky with a 1/3 overlap. Shoot them all in sequence, lock all your settings just like we did in the video portion, and then you can either do it in Lightroom or Photoshop, depending on which one you liked the best. As you can see, pano files, pretty fun to work with, pretty easy to set up, but on the negative side, very cumbersome. 110, 125 megapixels will make my computer bust into tears and probably bleed out of the keyboard. So we're not going to do that together. Instead, for this lesson, I want to concentrate on showing you guys actually how to make black and white imagery, but for that, we're going to switch back to a single RAW. So here we are back in Lightroom, and you can see we have these pano files. We have this new pano file that we created that's just obnoxiously large, and I have a single RAW. And this is a really simple scene, so I just want to do a couple things to it first. Again, those standard things, pulling the highlights down so we can get some of the definition back into the sky. May pull the exposure down a little bit, and this should become second nature to you guys now. Pull up the shadows just to get more of a balanced scene, so I have all these details that I can play around with here. Might even want to pull the whites down just a little bit. Now, there are a few ways to convert things into black and white. So here I'm going to walk you guys through a few different ways that you can start creating black and white imagery. The first one is really simple. This should be a no-brainer. The first thing, the easiest thing that you could possibly do is inside of Lightroom, you could take the saturation all the way down to -100. And when you do that, you have a very flat black and white result. Congratulations. Now you've created a black and white image. But how do we make it even more interesting? Well, thankfully, there's some better tools that we can use. And one of those tools is actually built right into Lightroom. So I'm going to change that back. I'm going to reset that saturation, just put it back to 0 because I don't really want to do it that way. Instead, I'm going to slide down. And I have these options down here. I have hue, saturation, lightness sliders, color, and this is where saturation can be changed. But I also have this one, B and W. And if I click on that, it's going to convert everything into black and white. But check this out. These are the default settings here. It creates this really nice S-curve. But this is going to give me individual control over the luminance of each channel. So think about the way that this looked like to begin with before I changed it. We have mostly gray. We have a little bit of orange, and we have some blue in the sky. And then check out this grass here. See how that's more of an orange-red color? Let's go back to B and W. What if I change that a little bit? What if I wanted to change this and make it more dynamic? Well, what if I wanted to bring these grass values up? I could do that simply by changing the yellow. If I start to change the yellow, you can see how that becomes more bright. And if I change the red and the orange, you can see now I'm pulling more highlight details out of this area and more highlight details around here. Remember the sky was mostly blue, so if I start to change that, you can see that I can change the sky values independently. So I can create a really dramatic, different looking black and white image, rather than just changing it completely from saturation to 0 to -100%, which just makes a flat black and white image. This gives me the ability to have finite control over the little details and create something with a little bit more personality. Now, this individual color control is the key to manipulating black and white images in pretty much any software that we work with. And again, Lightroom has a pretty nice control, but what if we wanted to do this in Photoshop and then add more effects, sharpening, all those things that we've been doing before? Well, here's how we do that. First thing that I'm going to do is turn the B&W off, and I'm going to export this into Photoshop just like we've been doing. So again, I'm going to go export. I'm going to make sure my settings haven't changed. PSD, Pro Photo, into my temp directory, open in Photoshop, and I'm going to hit export. First things first, If you guys are familiar with my work, you know that I like vibrant, super saturated, rich colors. So you probably don't remember a black and white image inside of my portfolio because there actually is not a black and white image inside of my portfolio at all. It doesn't mean I don't pick up work where I have to change things to black and white, or clients don't request black and white versions, but it's just not my style. It's not that I don't respect it. I love black and white imagery. It's just not really my thing, but I can show you exactly how to create it. So right now inside of Photoshop, we have just a background. There are a couple plugins we're going to use. We're going to get into that later, but the first thing that I want to do is show you the easiest way to get all of those settings back. The first way we can do it is we can create an adjustment layer here, and I'm going to first create a hue saturation, and you can see that that adjustment layer sits on top of my background layer, and I can toggle it on and off. It's basically a non-destructive way to do color correction on top of any layer in Photoshop. We're going to do the same thing that I did before. Saturation all the way down. Boring. It's really not that interesting, but that's the easiest way to do it. The second thing that I can do that's a little bit better, under adjustment layers, I can actually pick black and white. And if I pick black and white, now see what comes up? I get those same options that I had before. A few presets, I can tint it if I want to do a sepia effect or something else, but here's that same thing. Now I really like this grass to be pretty intense, so I can change those yellows again, bring up the reds, pull down the greens a little bit, and then I can change the blues. So I can create something that's either really bright, really dark and dramatic, where I can really accentuate these values right here. So that gives us the ability to do a little bit more personality, have a little bit more personality, and just something that's a little bit more unique. The nice thing about this is this sits right on top, so it doesn't apply it to the layer directly. So if I go to this layer, I can still do some really fun things like add tonal contrast or pro contrast. So let's just see if we can take this a little bit more, add a little bit more pop to the details, and a little bit more intensity just quickly by doing something we've done before in Nik software by going to Color Effects Pro and adding some pro contrast. So we're going to add some pro contrast here just to pop those details, maybe a little bit of color contrast. And then here's what I really like to do with black and white. If I add some tonal contrast, I can get really nice, harsh details. We don't have to worry about saturation. But if I start popping the midtones here and the shadows, you can see that it's really pulling those details out quite a bit, and I can say OK. Now this combined with that black and white effect, I think is going to look pretty cool. The other advantage here is this was a really flat day, so we're not dealing with much color. We could pull some color out of this, but the past few scenes that we worked on together, we had really muted light, so we had to work really hard to create that color balance and separation and vibrance in the channels. But this one, it really doesn't have that much color. To be honest, this scene is really best when there's just heavy light on it. At some parts of the year, the sunrise and the sunset just explodes with color behind this mountain, and it can be really spectacular. The day we were there, it was really nice for filming. It was great for shooting panos for demonstration, but we really didn't have that epic light. So we have to do stuff that, is a little bit different. In this case, we can create a really dramatic black and white image. And just the last thing that I can do here is just pull the opacity down, and I can do some different things. Something else I might want to do is see all these little white details in the foreground here on this dark background. I like the way that looks, but what if I wanted to accentuate that? I'm going to create another adjustment layer, and this is the first time we're really going to start working with adjustment layers. I'm going to create curves. Now curves, when you've never used it before, can seem really complicated. Back in the day when I used to do retouching, this is about 10 years ago, the reason I used curves over levels is because it would confuse the clients. They'd come over and they'd say, can you make this a little brighter? And I'd say, yeah, sure. And I'd pull the curves up and I'd change a couple things. And they were like, how do you know what to do on the curves? I'm like, well, it's just really complicated. But in truth, it's not complicated at all. Actually, it's the same thing that we've been doing inside of Lightroom. This is a gamma boost, is up and down, so that changes the tonality of the entire image, but it keeps our highlights and shadows in the same place. If I want to pull the highlights up, I can actually just clamp the levels this way. And just pay attention to the bottom of the screen here. You can see that I'm starting to get the details in those whites and grays. And if I pull this the other way, I'm going to clamp the blacks on the bottom. I don't want this over the entire image, so I'm just going to create a gradient. Again, this is a very simple mask. Black to white, or in this case, white to black. If I hit X on the keyboard, I swap foreground and background color, so that's going to be the direction I drag in, from white to black or black to white. In this case, from white to black and fading out to about here. So now this color corrector only exists down on the bottom, and you can see that I've popped some of that detail out. Last thing I can do, obviously, if I wanted to, I can add a high pass filter and pop those details out just a little bit more. So filter, we'll say other, and high pass. But before I do that, actually, I was using a low opacity, so we'll go all the way up to opacity 100%, and we'll go to high pass. High pass of 3, just like before, setting to overlay, and that should chisel out the details. So that's another way to do black and white inside of Photoshop, and it's pretty fun. It's a pretty easy thing you can do, and it gives you some great flexibility because nothing's baked in. If you do this inside of Lightroom, export it into Photoshop, it's going to be black and white in Photoshop. You don't have any control over the color if you change your mind. So this way we can actually turn these effects off and we can go right back into our color version. So it gives us a little bit more creative flexibility. That's 2 ways we create black and white imagery. Showed you one in Lightroom, now one in Photoshop, but what if you want to use a third-party plugin? Well, there's a few really great ones. Nik software has Silver Effects Pro. On1 software has black and white effects, and they're both really good. I personally like the On1 software version, so I'm going to show you that now. This is a complete option for you. It depends. It has a really nice tool set, gives you a bunch of advanced options. Again, it doesn't come standard with Photoshop. It's a $99 plugin package that's just as powerful as Nik software, and again, you can try it if you want to try it for this tutorial. You can download a 30-day free trial. The other thing with On1 software is we have a discount code that we've given you. If you check the documentations in this tutorial, you'll see a list of discount codes for all the things that we use to try to save you guys a few bucks if you do try to buy the final version. I'm going to select everything that I've done so far, and I'm going to create a folder. So I'm just going to save it so we can reference it later. And I'm going to actually duplicate this bottom layer, and I'm going to take it outside of the folder group so that we have it clean on the top. There we go. So that way I can just reference back and forth to what we created before inside of Photoshop. Now, On1 software is a little bit different. It's not actually in the filters. It's over here just like we did with the Pano stuff. It's actually going to be under Automate, and under Automate we can say Perfect Black and White Suite, BW Suite 9. On1 Perfect Effects, again, it's a suite of a bunch of different filters. Black and white is just one of the modules that you get for the whole price of the complete thing. It does everything that Nik software does all the detail, the tonal contrast, color contrast. It also has layers, has more robust editing features, and can be run as a standalone if you don't even want to go into Photoshop. It's pretty powerful, has a great browser. I really can't say too many good things about this software. It's really nice to have, but this is a really powerful piece too. And the nice thing is, if you look here on the left, I typically do not use presets. I like to build everything on my own, but if you saw something here that you really liked, a really contrasty image or something that's really light, washed out, or even a sepia tone, well, this one's called Wall Street for some reason, still looks pretty cool, you can start with one of those and then tweak accordingly. But basically inside of the software here, the first thing you'll see is brightness, contrast, highlight, shadows, and blacks and whites. So before we do any of the black and white control for the color channels, we can actually change and manipulate the brightness contrast of the image a little bit just to get something more that we like. And again, pulling the highlights is going to do a similar thing that we do recovering in RAW, and the shadows is just going to bump the shadows a little bit, and blacks and whites actually going to clip the black and white values. And detail is something that's really nice. I'm just going to crank this up a lot so you can see what's happening. That's basically taking place of our tonal contrast Nik software. So it's doing a nice global detail enhancement. Once you have your settings that you like here, we can go down, we can do the same thing that we did. Again, I'm really favoring changing the reds and yellows here and pulling some of the greens up. And then in this case, I'm not actually going to pull down the blues, I'm going to pull them up a little bit just to offset the mountain. So it's kind of nice. You can hit the auto button and see what happens, but I recommend doing it all manually or starting with one of the presets. There's a bunch of other things that we can do. There's toner, vignettes, borders, sharpening, glows, all sorts of different things that we can do here. So if I selected sharpening, for example, I could actually go in here, and I'll go ahead and turn on sharpening. And under sharpening, you can see that I have a progressive sharpening. I can actually turn the amount up, and I'll get the same thing that I would with a high pass filter. Change the details, different things like that. All sorts of different options to play with, but just at the very basic, we're able to get a pretty cool result. As soon as you like the result that you get, you click apply, and it's going to bring in a new layer into Photoshop. Back in Photoshop, with the On1 effect all applied, I'll delete this layer, and I just want to show you guys here, I'm going to take these color corrections off, leave the black and white here, basically, here's what I got inside of Photoshop, which is a little bit more dramatic, and then here's what I got inside of On1. And at this point, I could take the On1 software, add more color effects, add more adjustment layers, and basically make it my own style. We've been working so much on enhancing the color and bringing out the details and the lighting and everything like that. I just wanted to take a quick break from that, show you guys, one, how to stitch panos, and two, the black and white workflow. Now bear in mind, any of the stuff that we've done so far would also work as black and white imagery, and I know some of you guys really love black and whites and you want that for your portfolio. So with this whole series, the reason I'm giving the raw files to you guys is so that you can learn from me, you can learn my complete workflow, but you can also have files to practice on before you go into the field yourself. So feel free to experiment, feel free to do black and white, sepia tone, whatever you want, basically, however you want to develop your own style. But that basically wraps it up for this lesson. Next time, we're gonna get back into using those high color contrasts, and we're gonna start getting into some very basic exposure blending.